Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm doing a review for the first exam in a microeconomics class. So I'm talking about the basics of the economic perspective, assumptions, economic models like the circular flow model, supply and demand model, talk about elasticity, externalities, and public goods. Some topics that I won't talk about here are price controls and taxes in really great depth, though I'll talk about consumer and producer surplus, and I won't talk about the production possibilities frontier, though I talk about that in other videos. All right, so firstly, I want to make a distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics. So by microeconomics, we're focusing on single product or single service markets. We're thinking about the decisions made by individuals, households, or firms within those markets and the impact of the government. So this is contrasted with macroeconomics, which considers the entire economy as a whole. So macroeconomics concepts would be like gross domestic product, inflation, monetary and fiscal policy, so on and so forth. Microeconomics is focused on just a single product or service market and the interactions of individuals within those markets. All right, so overall, though, economics is unified. We're focusing on the same sort of set of issues and using a lot of the same tools. We could think of economics as focusing on the consequences of scarcity. So economics is the study of how people make choices while attempting to satisfy their unlimited wants with scarce, limited resources. And every society has to come up with a way to deal with scarcity. Market systems are the best way to maximize total productivity because a market system leads to the efficient allocation of resources. And of course, we might argue about whether economic efficiency is the best way to judge a system, but there's no question that the market-based system maximizes efficiency, meaning it's the best way to stretch resources the furthest to raise standard of living generally throughout the society. Market systems are characterized by the private ownership of capital and productive resources, which is contrasted with the centralized systems, central planner, where the government would own the means of production. So one reason why centralized planners don't do as well as the market-based system is the lack of information. Centralized planners can't possibly gather all the information that's necessary to optimize. But market systems do, and they do this through the price signal. Basically, market systems crowdsource all the information that's necessary to make economic decisions via market-determined prices. So now part of our goal in studying economics is to come up with a unique perspective on the world and about markets within it. So in doing so, economists make simplifying assumptions to be able to abstract away the complexity and focus on the specific thing that we're interested in studying. So, for instance, we assume economic agents are self-interested and rational, meaning people seek what's in their own best interest, and then they don't do things that are bad for themselves. Optimizers compare the marginal benefit to the marginal cost. That's our marginal principle. It's actually based in calculus, and it's exploiting the fact that the optimal level of a variable occurs where the marginal benefit equals marginal cost. If the marginal benefit is larger than the marginal cost, you should do more of that activity. If the marginal benefit is smaller than the marginal cost, you should do less of that activity. And the optimal is where marginal benefit exactly equals the marginal cost. So a key feature to the economic perspective is comparing marginal benefits to marginal costs in decision making. Another key idea is the idea of opportunity costs. I've got a couple separate videos explaining opportunity costs, but I'll talk about it briefly here. The mix-up that students often come up with is thinking of opportunity cost as like something that you're getting or some type of gain. No. Opportunity cost, literally it's the cost, it's the loss, right? The opportunity cost of an action is what's foregone or sacrificed when you do one thing instead of the alternative. So if I spend $5 on parking, I lose that $5. I lose the ability to spend those $5 at the coffee shop next door, right? So the opportunity cost of the $5 spent on parking is the foregone ability to buy a coffee or whatever. Now, I still might buy something from the coffee shop as I pass by, but I have $5 less to spend than if I had been, for instance, dropped off by a friend or if I had walked there, right? Each of these activities still, being dropped off by a friend or walking there, carries their own costs. There's the opportunity cost, the foregone use of those resources employed doing something else, right? Opportunity costs capture the next highest alternative use of your resources. So for instance, the opportunity cost of getting up 30 minutes earlier to work out is the foregone value of that time spent sleeping. Opportunity costs measure losses, not gains. Economists use models to study the world around us. The first model you typically encounter in any economics course is the circular flow model, which basically reinforces the idea that households sell resources to firms and firms sell products to households. So what happens is households have resources, time, and sometimes other productive resources that they sell in a factor market to the firm. The firm is a buyer in the factor market, buys labor, uses it and other resources to produce products that it then sells in the product market. So the firm is a seller in the product market, and consumers and households are buyers in the product market. And that's how it gets linked around. The income that consumers have to purchase in the product market is their gains from selling their resources in the factor markets, and there's the model, right? So the circular flow model, it's actually just useful for demonstration only. It's a useful tool to help students think about how the economy works and some of the interrelationships at the sort of most general level. The next model we encounter, and a way more useful one, is a supply and demand model. So the basics of supply and demand are as follows. We have a demand curve. It's a collection of the set of plans for consumers. For each possible price, there's a quantity demanded. By the law of demand, at higher prices, there's a lower quantity demanded. At lower prices, there's a higher quantity demanded. Buyers like low prices, buyers don't like high prices. From any initial price, if the price rises, then quantity demanded falls. If the price falls, then quantity demanded rises. So if price changes, quantity changes. In fact, when prices change, only quantity can change. The consumers aren't changing their plans. Their demand curve isn't changing. They're just following them. So we represent changes in prices causing changes in quantities as a movement along a single demand curve. So to get a shift, to actually shift the demand curve, you have to have something other than price changing. So if demand is increasing, that's a rightward shift. If demand decreases, that's a leftward shift of the whole demand curve. And we've got a collection of recognizable demand shifters that could do one or the other of these. So for demand shifters, it's a change in the number of buyers, it's a change in consumer incomes, it's a change in consumer tastes and preferences, changes in the prices of related goods, and changes in expected future prices. So incomes is important because you might think if income rises, that should lead to an increase in demand, which is true if we have a normal good. A normal good is one where when incomes rise, you buy more of it. That's like most things we buy. However, if the good is inferior, then as your income rises, you buy less of it. So an inferior good is one where when consumer incomes rise, they buy less. When consumer incomes fall, they buy more. So, in order to determine which direction the demand curve moves, you need to stipulate whether we have a normal or inferior good. Prices of related goods are important, so this would be goods like substitutes or complements. So, substitutes are goods that are used in place of each other. Complements are goods that are used alongside each other. So, if the price of a substitute rises, you get a decrease in quantity demanded of that substitute, and you'll get an increase in demand for the good under consideration. Like if the good we care about is Pepsi, the price of Coke rises, you get a decrease in quantity demanded of Coke, but you get an increase in demand for Pepsi. If we're thinking about two goods used together, so I don't know, like hot dogs and hot dog buns, if the price of one rises, you get a lower quantity demanded of that good, but because they're used together, you buy less of the other, so you get a decrease in demand of the good under consideration. So the price of peanut butter rises, you buy less peanut butter. Jelly is a complement to peanut butter, so you buy less jelly as well. So you get an increase in the price of peanut butter leads to a decrease in quantity demanded of peanut butter and a decrease in demand for jelly. Right. Complements. All right, so the supply curve works similarly, but on the supply side, right? So we have a collection of the set of plans of sellers represented by our supply curve. For each possible price, there's a quantity supplied, and then by the law of supply, at higher prices, there's a larger quantity supplied. At lower prices, there's a lower quantity, there's a lower quantity supplied. Sellers like high prices, sellers don't like low prices. So if price falls, the quantity supplied changes. From any initial price, if the price rises, quantity supplied rises. And what's happening is more sellers are now able to be recruited into the market because the price is rising higher than their production costs. So now they're able to operate or bring more goods to the market. Anyway, so if the price changes, only quantity can change. And we'd represent the change in quantity supplied with a movement along a single supply curve. In order to get a shift, again, you need something other than price to change. So we have a whole collection of recognizable supply shifters, like a change in the number of sellers, a change in the price of important inputs, change in production technology, changes in the price of related goods the firm could also produce, and then changes in expected future prices. So prices of related goods, so think of like Apple. Apple can make iPods, iPads, and iPhones with largely the same components. If the price that consumers are willing to pay for an iPhone rises, Apple's going to increase their quantity supplied of iPhones and decrease their supply of iPods and iPads, because they're going to want to take those components and put them into iPhones that are now relatively more lucrative. Right. So basically, with shifters, you want to identify something other than price changing. And if you have something other than price changing, now your task is only to determine, is this affecting the demand or the supply curve? If you have price changing, it can only affect the change. It can only cause a change in quantity, right? So if demand increases, if we get a rightward shift of demand, we're going to get an increase in price and quantity. So you should do this graphically, like draw a graph, show the demand curve shifting to the right against a stationary supply curve. The crossing point is going to involve a higher price and a lower quantity. Prices on the vertical, quantities on the horizontal. But we can also think about this apart from the graph. And so I like reinforcing both types of logic. So if we have demand increasing, price is going to rise, quantity is going to rise. And the way that I think about this is with consumers competing the price up. If there's an increase in demand, you have consumers getting more interested in the product, they're competing with each other to drive the price up, and of course the quantity is rising. If demand decreases, we expect price and quantity to fall. I think about this as consumers losing interest, and then the price that they're willing to pay falls, the market price falls. If supply increases, we expect price to fall and quantity to rise. I think of this as flooding the market. Now there's just an abundance of the goods, so the price falls. If supply decreases, we expect price to rise and quantity to fall. We think of this as like increasing scarcity. Whatever this thing is increasingly rare, so the price has to rise and the quantity's fallen. All right, if both curves are moving at the same time, we actually have to consider all the possible alternatives. So we have to think about whether the demand side or the supply side is going to have a larger impact on the market price and quantity, and to what extent they might agree on the direction of the effect on one of the variables. Actually, so the supply and demand effect will agree for either price or quantity. It'll disagree for the other. So the effect on price or quantity is known for sure. The effect on the other one is going to be ambiguous or indeterminate. I recommend drawing two different pictures, one where demand shifts further than supply and one where supply shifts further than demand. But they got to be the same, representing the same direction of shifts. So for instance, if you have a decrease in demand and a decrease in supply, right, leftward shifts of both, I would draw one picture. Do this, like draw one picture where you have leftward shifts of demand and supply, but demand shifts further to the left than supply. Overall price is going to fall and quantity falls. If you have demand and supply both shifting to the left, but supply shifts further to the left than demand, overall price rises and quantity falls. So you can get this logic the other way. If we have a decrease in demand, that's going to tend towards consumers losing interest in the product. So price falls, quantity falls. If we have a decrease in supply, we have the outcome where we have increasing scarcity, where whatever is the product is more rare, so the price is going to rise and the quantity is going to fall. Well, in both of those scenarios, I talked about quantity falling, right? So they're going to agree, a decrease in demand and a decreased supply agree that there's going to be a decrease in quantity. They disagree in terms of what happens to price. If supply decreases, if that's the story, price rises. If demand decreases more, if that's the story, price falls. Right? All right, so I mentioned efficiency earlier, and one of our conclusions is basically the competitive market, as represented by the basic supply and demand model, produces the most efficient outcome. So we measure efficiency by the total economic surplus created in the market. Total surplus is just the sum of consumer and producer surplus. Graphically, it's the area below the demand curve and above the supply curve. It's a big triangle. And to the left of the market equilibrium quantity. Consumer surplus measures the gain to consumers when purchasing the product. It's the difference between their maximal willingness to pay and the price they actually pay. Graphically, it's the area under the demand curve and above the market price. Producer surplus is the gain to producers. It's like profits. Actually, if there's no fixed cost, producer surplus and profits are the same. Graphically, it's the area under the market price and above the supply curve. It's the difference between the amount that producers are actually, the market price, what they're actually receiving for the product they're selling, and then whatever are their costs, whatever was their reservation price or their willingness to sell. Total surplus is maximized when there's no deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is just inefficiency. It implies that there's unconsummated gains from trade. Deadweight loss occurs when the quantity actually traded in the market is smaller than whatever would have been the equilibrium quantity. And that basically happens in the presence of taxes, price controls, externalities, among other things. So what are externalities? Externalities are bystander effects. Basically, the idea is some activities create spillover effects that impact those other than the original decision makers. Externalities can be positive or negative, they can be good or bad, and I like to distinguish between primary activities and external effects to help keep everything clear. So here's an example. The primary activity is smoking in an apartment complex. So there's costs and benefits to the smoker themselves, but there's also bystanders, others living in the apartment complex. The externality is secondhand smoke because it's an external effect that's going to affect bystanders. It decreases the health of the bystanders and might bother them to smell the smoke and so on and so forth. There's an important distinction between externalities and unintended consequences. What matters is who is affected. So secondhand smoke is a negative externality because it affects other people. Now, if the smoker themselves gets lung cancer, though it is an unintended consequence, it's not an externality. We would just call it a direct harm to the individual. Externalities require bystanders. It's like the old question, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? You have to have somebody there to hear the sound, which would be the externality. All right, so if the smoker lives alone and if there's no one else affected by the smoke, then there's no bystanders, so there's no externality. We classify goods according to the properties of rivalry and excludability. Rivalry refers to whether one person's consumption of the good affects how much remains in the universe for other people. So then excludability refers to whether we can limit who consumes the good to paying customers, for instance. This gives rise to private goods, club goods, common resources, and public goods. Private goods are rival and excludable. Club goods are excludable and non-rival. Common resources are rival but non-excludable. And public goods are non-rival and non-excludable. In-N-Out Burger's Double Burger is rival because when I eat one, there's one less in the universe for everyone else. And it's excludable because you have to buy one to be able to obtain it. Concerts are club goods. They're excludable because you have to buy a ticket for admission, but they're non-rival because one more person at the concert doesn't diminish how much of the concert remains for other people. Air and water in the environment are common resources because everyone has full access to the air we breathe and the water around us, but when we use the air or water, that diminishes the quality and how much remains for everybody else. Now, there's a natural system, of course, that replenishes these things, and so long as that system's not overwhelmed, the common resource persists. The problem that arises with common resources is the tragedy of the commons, which is basically where the resource gets degraded if the usage overwhelms the ability to naturally replenish. Public goods are non-rival and non-excludable, like fireworks or national defense, where everyone's able to benefit from these things and no individual has to pay. The problem with public goods is free riding, consuming without paying. So no one individual has the incentive to pay, and this leads to too little funding of the public good, which is one of the primary reasons for centralized or government funding for public goods. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is elasticity. When prices rise or fall, we know demand and supply react. The law of demand tells us if the price rises, quantity demanded falls, price falls, quantity demanded rises. The law of supply tells us if the price rises, quantity supplied rises, price falls, quantity supplied falls. What elasticity gives us is a way to think about how much the quantity reacts. Elastic means very responsive, inelastic means not very responsive, typically to price. We have four main elasticities: price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, income elasticity, and cross-price elasticity. Price elasticity of demand is just the percentage change in the quantity demanded for a given percentage change in price. Price elasticity of supply is just the percentage change in quantity supplied for a given percentage change in price. income elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded for a given percentage change in income. And cross-price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity demanded of some good A for a percentage change in price of some good B. So price elasticity of demand tells us, is demand responsive or unresponsive to changes in price? If price changes a little and the quantity changes a lot, we'd say demand is elastic. If price changes a lot and quantity only changes a little, we'd say demand is inelastic. Same thing for price elasticity of supply. The difference is price elasticity of demand will always be negative, so often we'll talk about it in absolute value. That just comes from the demand curve downward sloping, so price and quantity move in opposite directions. Price elasticity of supply is always positive. Income elasticity tells us how responsive price or how responsive quantity is to changes in income. So what really matters for income elasticity is the sign. If income rises and quantity demanded rises, then we'd say we have a normal good. If income rises and quantity demanded falls, we have an inferior good. So if the income elasticity is positive, we have a normal good. If the income elasticity is negative, we have an inferior good. Also, the responsiveness matters. So if the income elasticity computes to something larger than 1, we'd say we've got a normal good that's a luxury. If it computes to something between 0 and 1, it's a normal good that's a necessity. Cross-price elasticity tells us something about substitutes and complements. So a positive cross-price elasticity tells us the goods are substitutes. We have an increase in the price of one good that increased the quantity of the other. That's substitutes behavior. If the cross-price elasticity is negative, we have complements. Increase in the price of one decreases the quantity of the other. So we increase the price of one, we use less of both, for instance. Price elasticity of demand also is relevant to revenue. Now, revenue is just price times quantity. So when prices change by the law of demand, the quantity is going to change. Price rises, quantity falls. Price falls, quantity rises. So there's two forces coming through revenue for a given price change. Now, if demand's elastic, we get a smaller price change and a larger quantity change. If demand is inelastic, we get a larger price change and a smaller quantity change. So in order to increase revenue, when demand is elastic, we want to lower prices because the price falls, that tends to lower revenue, but the quantity effect is far greater, that tends to raise revenue. If demand is inelastic, we want to raise prices. Raising the prices will increase revenue, and then there's a decrease in revenue coming through the quantity, but since the quantity change is far smaller than the price change when demand is inelastic, the way to increase revenue for inelastic demand is to raise prices. This all being the case, remember, firms are interested in maximizing profits, not maximizing revenue. The one case where this is identical is if there's no costs, because profits is just revenue minus costs. So if there's no cost, such as if there's zero marginal cost, then the revenue maximizing quantity, revenue maximizing outcome is exactly the profit maximizing outcome. And as silly as that might sound, actually for information goods, the marginal cost of production is effectively zero. So it's not, we do have situations where revenue maximizing and profit maximizing is actually the same thing, although it's not typical. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude here. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.